this debt, this destruction.
Global news impacts us.
We have to change the way we live.
This is why we need independent media.
Cheers and salutations. Welcome one and all to a very special episode of Hard Lens Media. In this day and age, we need to stand up against the military-industrial complex and the narratives that corporate media has been spewing at us. Now, recently on yesterday's show, we did speak about Jimmy Dore, Chicago's very own, speaking at the United Nations, addressing the United Nations in regards towards the Nord Stream pipeline, as well as this ongoing ridiculous war in which billions of our dollars are going into it. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like it's going to be stopping anytime soon. So it's one thing for me to talk about the video, but instead, I'm going to bring on the gentleman who was addressing the United Nations. Give it up for Chicago's very own, the one and only Jimmy Dore. Jimmy, how are you?
Kid, I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, and I appreciate all the positive coverage you gave me.
No problem. Well, here's the thing. I think very few of us were made aware that this was going to be happening. So, now, obviously, we will be playing the video at the end of this interview because obviously, we got a little bit there's a time difference to where you're at. But I think it's important that we start from the beginning. A lot of people are probably wondering, well, how did you get a chance to address the United Nations? And what was your overall message in regards to trying to at least make the public as aware of what is happening with this conflict that should never have happened in the first place? Take it away, Jimmy.
Well, I was invited by the Security Council of Russia as a representative to speak on the Nord Stream pipeline anniversary, which was September 26th, 2022. And at first I didn't want to, just because what's been happening to everybody who does speak out. Look what's happened to Russell Brand. And I knew it was just going to put a bigger target on my back. But I thought of it, and I didn't announce it to anybody because I was leaning towards not doing it. But I thought, someone's got to do it. Someone's got to say something. And it seems that Russia is the only one who wants to talk about the Nord Stream pipeline. And right now, Norway, Sweden, Germany, they're all slow walking the investigation, and they don't want to even talk about it. So I took the opportunity to speak to the members of the Security Council. I think there are 15 countries on the Security Council. And I got to talk about, where the Nord Stream pipeline, what the context in which this happened, which was the backdrop of the Ukraine war. And what I said in my speech was that, the people in the West think that Vladimir Putin just woke up one day and out of the blue decided to invade Ukraine because he's an evil thug and a monster. And it's because the Western media starts the story about the Ukraine war somewhere near the end. And the example I gave was that if there was an old lady standing in the street at a bus stop and a bus was coming straight for her, and Vladimir Putin happened to see this happening and he pushed the old lady out of the way and she fell onto the sidewalk, the Western media would start that story right there. Hey, Vladimir Putin pushes down old lady onto sidewalk. And they would leave out the context, which is exactly how they report the Ukraine war. They started from February 2022, which was Putin's invasion of Ukraine. They leave out the 2014 coup that the United States instigated with Nazis in Ukraine to overthrow the democratically elected government of Ukraine. And then the people in the eastern part of Ukraine, called the Donbass, they're the Russian-speaking ethnics who identify with Russia. They didn't want to go along with the coup government that just got overthrown by the CIA and Nazis. And so how did Ukraine respond? They started shelling the people in the Donbass, and they killed somewhere around 18,000 of them. And that's what eventually led, that and the expansion of NATO, the threat of the expansion of NATO into Ukraine, is what led Vladimir Putin to actually invade Ukraine. And they always leave that out. And now we have the Secretary General of NATO admitting that they could have avoided this war had they just guaranteed Vladimir Putin that they would not expand NATO into Ukraine. They refused to do that. Why do you think they refused to do that, Kit? It's because they wanted this confrontation. It was so if you go back to the end of the Afghanistan war, and people were giving Joe Biden credit for ending the Afghanistan war. And I said, no, you don't give him credit for this. What we have to first see what he's going to do with the money that they've been spending in Afghanistan. Is he going to take that money and reinvest it back here, or are they going to find another war? And that's exactly what they did. The reason why the military-industrial complex and Wall Street allowed Joe Biden to end that war in Afghanistan is because they had another one in Ukraine that they had been ramping up since 2014. And there was already a peace agreement in Ukraine. There was two of them called the Minsk Accords. Guess who broke those peace agreements? Was it Russia? No, it was Ukraine, NATO, and the CIA in the United States. They're the ones who don't want peace. They're the ones who want endless conflict, just like Julian Assange told us. These wars are not meant to be won. These wars are meant to be endless and to continue the upward transfer of wealth from the citizenry to the international security state. And so I was given an opportunity to tell this to people on a global scale, on a global stage at the UN, the Security Council, and I thought it was my duty to do it no matter what the ramifications negatively on me. And so I'm glad I did it.
Well, I think on behalf of every one of us who's been talking about how this war got started, I think it's about time that people hear another side, because since the war started, especially in February of 2022, which was last year, there's been this ongoing push by the media to say that this war is just, we must stop Putin, we must do everything we can. But I've been noticing that there's been a shift in the mindset of people, because the media at one point used to report on how corrupt Ukraine was, or that there were Nazi and quote unquote Nazi adjacent paramilitary groups in Ukraine. And we're also witnessing, as well as how the American public, not just conservatives, but everyone is getting rightfully angry at the fact that billions of dollars are going to Ukraine, yet the people of Maui, who had their entire community decimated by the most deadly wildfire in U.S. and Hawaiian history, are getting a measly $700 if they do get it, and their communities are being displaced. So I just want to get, it's one thing to speak out, and you speaking at the UN, and of course there's been this massive hit of censorship, especially towards what they're trying to do to Russell Brand. But what is your overall thought on how the general public, especially here in the United States, has shifted their tone? Because a while you could not say, hey, maybe we should stop this war, maybe we should be against it, and you were vilified, very similar to how the beginning stages of the war in Iraq. Do you think there's a growing pushback amongst everyone across the political spectrum here that, hey, maybe we need to stop this war and stop giving billions of dollars in aid? Do you think that's gaining any ground, or is this just a blip on the radar and it's just going to pass away?
Well, it's kind of hard to ignore that the United States government is expanding internationally, imperialistically, economically, hegemonically, and then they're not, and they're starving their own people back at home. We still don't have health care, but we're paying for the health care of everybody in Ukraine. It's amazing. We're paying for their firemen, we're paying for their policemen, we're paying for their nurses and doctors and healthcare in Ukraine, while we're denying those things to people at home. And I think the Maui situation really brought it into focus for people. And also right now, when we have this asylum crisis and they won't close the border, and you have to ask yourself, well, why do they keep the border open? Why is it such a sieve? And why does the establishment, meaning the Republicans and the Democrats, have no interest in closing that border? And it's because they want to have as many low-paid workers as they possibly can. I mean, you saw AOC and the Democrats, and they're out there screaming, we have to get work permits for these asylum seekers immediately. Hey, whoa, the last thing we need to do is suppress wages more at home. But that's exactly what the point of this is happening. And so people are starting to wake up. People in quote unquote sanctuary cities are saying that this is a crazy policy. We can't take care of our own people. And so it's Maui, it's Ukraine, it's immigration. People, I think, now are slowly waking up to that game. And so they have to clamp down even harder with censorship, because that's all they have is narrative control. And if they can't control the narrative and censor people, then they have to start disappearing people. And that's a lot harder to control. So right now they're putting a chill in. They're trying to get rid of Rumble. Right. So, yes. And they're using all this stuff. They're using all this power that they possibly can of the establishment and the oligarchy. And let's remember, it's, there's a movie called Network that was from 1975. And in it, they talk about Ned Beatty talks about how there are no countries anymore. There are only companies and the international flow of dollars. And you can't upset that. And if you do upset that, you will be taken out. And that's what this is all about. This isn't about. So the people who actually run the world, which is a handful of billionaires, we know right now that the one guy is in charge of health policy at the WHO, and that is Bill Gates. He's the number one donor to the WHO. Why do I bring that up? Because on YouTube and everybody and everywhere else, we have to follow the WHO guidelines, and if we go against it, we'll be censored, shut down, and we'll lose our voice. And who is dictating that policy? Well, it's Bill Gates. Bill Gates, the number one investor in vaccines. He's the number one investor in the WHO. And the former head of the WHO admitted that they have to do exactly what their donors tell them to do, or else they won't get any more money. So Bill Gates, China's the number one donor to the WHO. Second, a very, very close second, is Bill Gates. And then he also does it through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Gavi, which is another international vaccine, pro-vaccine organization that he founded. And so people don't know this. So literally one billionaire is dictating the policy for COVID, for vaccines, and for free speech around all those things. So there is no debate. And so I don't know how many times I've been fake fact-checked on Facebook by a bullshit organization that is funded by Bill Gates, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or another billionaire like that, and that's all garbage. And so this is what's happening, and you see what's going. It just blows my mind to watch other quote unquote independent news shows report on Russell Brand, and as if what's happening is legitimate. What's happening is they're using any excuse to silence the critics of the establishment, and that doesn't put their hair on fire. It makes them say, well, Russell Brand isn't a good person because he broke up with Katy Perry over a text, so he's a bad guy. It is remarkable, but those are the same people who got COVID wrong, Kit. So if you watch, the people who got COVID wrong also got free speech wrong, censorship wrong, and they're getting Russell Brand wrong at the top of their lungs, and they're not embarrassed. They're the same people who getting Cornel West campaign wrong. So it's remarkable to see, and they're also the people who get identity politics wrong, right? So and we're being forced to talk about identity politics on a daily basis. We're being forced to push back against the agenda that wants us to focus on identity, our sexuality, on trans people, on LGBTQ, on white supremacy, and all that. This is being all those issues have been co-opted by the establishment. That is not stuff that is coming from the bottom up. That is stuff that's coming from the top down. And why? It's so that we don't come together under a class consciousness. So we don't organize along class lines like Christian Smalls did on Staten Island. And so we do see ourselves and our neighbor as the enemy instead of the oligarchy as the enemy, and it's working perfectly. I see a lot of people who consider themselves outspoken anti-war critics, outspoken freedom of the press advocates for Julian Assange, totally shit the bed on COVID, totally shit the bed on Russell Brand, and totally shit the bed on identity politics and white supremacy because they have no idea that they're being manipulated by the establishment to separate the left. And it's obvious to me, and it should be obvious to more people now. And I think people are starting to wake up to this, that this is all being used to manipulate us, especially what happened in Maui, especially what's happening in sanctuary cities, and especially what we find out. Even 60 Minutes is reporting now that the United States is paying for healthcare, is paying the teachers, is paying the hospital workers, the doctors, the first responders, the cops, the street sweepers, everybody. We're paying for everything in Ukraine while we won't do that for our own people in the United States. And that's because there isn't a money interest in it in the United States. What the Ukraine war is a money laundering organization. It's a money laundering operation. And that's why they have to keep this war going. And they have no interest in peace. And that's why they have to criminalize the people who oppose this war, just like Donald Trump and anybody who goes against the expansion of the police state, like Stop Cop City and Donald Trump. So Donald Trump was prosecuted, is being indicted under the RICO statute, and just same thing as the Stop Cop City protesters are. Let's remember what RICO is. RICO was invented in the 70s specifically to target the mafia, which is why nobody cared about it, because, oh, you're only going to use it against bad people. Well, now they're using it against their political opponents, whether they be powerful political opponents like Donald Trump and his movement, or be powerless political opponents like Stop Cop City. So I hope that people, and you know, I had intellectuals on my show pretend not to see the connection to those two things, and that is so disappointing. It's despicable. And so if you're going to pretend, so when they come for you next, there's going to be nobody to say anything, and you deserve it. So I'm here to speak out against it. I'm here to wake people up, and I'm pretty sure that people are waking up to this.
Here's something else I do want to address, especially because I know, like, again, time is short, but in regards towards how this entire conflict has been happening in Ukraine and how the media is quick to censor people like Rumble, or try and go after Rumble, or silence Russell Brand, which is again, it is a witch hunt. You know, we got a few more months until we enter the year of 2024. So we are in September, October, November, then comes December. Do you think the censorship is going to intensify even further? Because again, there's going to be a presidential election. Trump obviously is dealing with his indictments. Joe Biden is clearly not there mentally or physically. And the whole media apparatus, the trust in corporate media, is withering away. The establishment is losing its grip. CNN is hemorrhaging money and viewers. Dare I say, we could witness a corporate media outlet go bankrupt, ideally. But do you think the establishment is going to be intensifying its censorship, or will there be a more pushback from the populace? Because people can only take so much. Again, this election won't deal with identity politics. It's going to deal with the economy and the dollars. I want to get your thoughts before we have to send you out.
Well, I know this, that there was a Republican debate, and the establishment is perfectly fine having any one of those guys on stage be the president of the United States, along with anybody who calls themselves a Democrat, except RFK Jr. The establishment is 100% okay with Joe Biden. They're 100% okay with DeSantis. They're 100% okay with Pence. They like anybody who's going to do the bidding of the military-industrial complex, oil, fossil fuel companies, and Wall Street. And that's exactly who. Why do you think Kamala Harris is the vice president? Because she's popular, because she has good ideas. She was the one that the Wall Street wanted to be president in the first place. If you remember, she was the first one anointed on Martha's Vineyard. She was anointed by the Wall Street insiders, and then she couldn't get a vote, so they had to go to their next most reliable dupe for Wall Street, which has been Joe Biden for the last 45 years. So that's how Joe Biden became president, and she became vice president. Not because anybody liked those people or wanted to vote for them. That's because the Wall Street chose those people. Our leaders are chosen. Every election in my lifetime, there's been one winner, and it's been Goldman Sachs. So people need to wake up to that. It doesn't matter if Barack Obama was not a departure from George Bush. I've talked about this a million times. His entire cabinet came from an email from Citigroup, and I know about that because of Julian Assange, which is why they're trying to kill him right now, and Joe Biden is torturing him right now. And nobody gives a shit about that. I can't believe that there are people who call themselves independent journalists, and they are literally spreading propaganda for Joe Biden's election. Meanwhile, he's torturing and trying to kill free speech and our most important journalist of our generation, Julian Assange. How you can tell anybody to vote for that guy or support that guy and call yourself a journalist is beyond me. You're a propagandist and a liar and a willing enemy of the people. So if you see these people in independent news spaces claiming that you should vote for Joe Biden or somehow he's better than a Republican, those people are liars, those people are charlatans, and you should call those people out.
I think there's also a really big anger towards the fact that people are, well, there's this attempt on social media and even on corporate media of trying to present Joe Biden as somewhat electable. But again, you can't hide the polling data. The data is showing that Americans are not confident in his age. They're not confident with his policies, and they're overall upset in regards to how he's been handling issues, both foreign and domestic. And it's more or less finally, I guess, the children, I guess how you said, like, the American people, we are the children of alcoholics, and finally the children are saying, hey, can you stop throwing these beer cans at us? Many people are starting to find their voice, but there are a lot of people who are sitting in the sidelines. What do you want to say to people that want to speak out, that want to really have their voice heard, but are overall afraid of the cancel culture. Because let's face it, it's all too real. They're going after Russell Brand, and obviously he is a celebrity. He's someone of higher stature, but they're doing everything they can to frame him as this monster. They've done the same attacks to Joe Rogan. They've done attacks to you. They've done attacks against Tucker Carlson. They've come after independent media. Hard Lens Media has been censored not once, but 8 times on YouTube, and thankfully we've been able to recover. But overall, when you hear stories like this, everyone's afraid of, oh, I might be put on the chopping block. What do you want to say to people who are sitting on the fence who do want to speak out and do what you did by addressing the UN?
Well, I would just, it's that old saying, Kurt, when they came for the Jews, I didn't say anything because I wasn't a Jew. And when they came for the trade unionists, I didn't say anything because I wasn't a trade unionist. And when they came for me, there was nobody left to say anything. So if you value your own freedom, your own liberty, and your own bodily autonomy, then you should speak out now, because if you don't, when they come for you, there'll be nobody left to speak up for you. So this didn't start with Russell Brand. This started with most recently, it started with Julian Assange. And they've got everybody bamboozled into thinking he's some kind of a Russian dupe. And then they moved on to Glenn Greenwald, and then it moved on to Joe Rogan, and people like us, and people like Tucker Carlson. And let's remember, Tucker Carlson didn't get fired for lying. They lie all day long at cable news, especially Fox News. They're lying to you right now about COVID. They're lying to you right now about the Ukraine war. They're lying to you right now about Russell Brand. And the reason why Tucker Carlson got fired was because he started to tell the truth about those things. We're right now building another military base inside Syria, which is another country next to Ukraine that we're illegally occupying. Of course, nobody talks about that in the Western media. Nobody talks about we just built 3 more new military bases in the Philippines to ramp up for our saber rattling with another nuclear power in China. Nobody seems to care about this stuff. Why? Because the media doesn't care about it, and they ignore it. And so people like you and people like Russell Brand, Glenn Greenwald, Tucker Carlson, Joe Rogan, and us, we have to be silenced, discredited, and marginalized, and they will. They've done it. I mean, I've been censored. How many hit pieces have they written about me? And so as somebody as small as me, they're going to come after. So they have to have complete control of the narrative. And if they lose control of that narrative, it's all over. But what we really need is for people to get in the streets, and we need people to shut it down, which is why they also had to demonize the truckers in Canada, because that was effective as hell. And so they had to call them white supremacists. They had to call them Nazis. And then you just saw that the entire parliament in Canada just saluted an actual Nazi, because it fits their propaganda war narrative. So we've been in bed with Al Qaeda. We've been in bed with Al Nusra. We've been in bed, and now we're in bed with Nazis. So literally funding them. And so somebody else is a right winger. Somebody else in America is more of a fascist, white supremacist than the United States government, who is funding Nazis. No, that isn't. So, but they want you to focus on your neighbor. They want you to think that Trumpers are your enemy. They're not your enemy. They're in the same class that you are. And what they're afraid of is that you'll realize that and you'll join with them. That's the big fear, that people from the left and the right will realize we have a common enemy, and that we don't blame each other, because the people who are in MAGA, who vote for Donald Trump, they didn't shut down our economy. They didn't make me lose my bodily autonomy. They didn't lie to me about an experimental medical treatment that people were forced to take or they lose their job. They're still doing that, by the way. Pasadena College, where I live, Pasadena College, going forward this fall, all the students and all the faculty have to be vaccinated. So it's not stopping. It's still going. And it's because they have a stranglehold on the narrative. There's only 6 media corporations. And who made that happen? A Democrat, Bill Clinton, in 1996, the Telecommunications Act, which took us from 50 giant media organizations down to 6. And so now they have a stranglehold on the narrative, and it's only a handful of people are willing to speak out. So I encourage everybody to speak out, get informed, because if you don't, there's what's the old saying? I think Benjamin Franklin said it. He said, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And so we're living through that right now. And it's amazing to see how many people, look at all the people who consider themselves outspoken lefties, anti-war voices, pro-Julian Assange voices, who are silent on the COVID narrative, which was 100% fascism that was homegrown, and we're still living with it. And they just want to memory hole it like it didn't happen, like it's not still happening. And the censorship that happened around that, they started censoring Alex Jones, and everybody was like, well, that's good. And I had to warn everybody they're going to come. Well, it went from Alex
Precisely,
Jones,
yeah.
and it went to the former president of the United States, to the leading scientists and doctors in their field, to then everybody else. And now half the country's totally, more than half the country is totally okay with censorship. And so that's what that means, that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. So if you don't start pushing back now, it's over. It is already over. Our democracy was stolen from us decades ago, and people think it would happen on January 6th. Those people were trying to overflow the government. That's the biggest joke in the world, too. People come on my show and they talk about January 6th, and Cornel West did that. Came on my show and pretended that the people who were protesting the election at the Capitol were there to interrupt the peaceful transfer of power. Really, a bunch of gun nuts wanted to overthrow the government, and they forgot their guns. You're being stupid on purpose, and you're being a propagandist on purpose if you're someone who says those things. And those people need to wake up, and we need to wake them up or shout them down.
Precisely. And I think now more than ever, we need to find our voices and fight for a better future. And it's good to see people starting to wake up. And you're one of the few voices that's been speaking truth to power, as there are so many others. So finally, Jimmy Dore, I know you're on tour. I think right now you're on vacation. All the best to you. It's well deserved. And we're looking forward to having your show back here in the city of Chicago. So when that happens, just let us know. We're more than happy to check it out. But until then, Jimmy, I'm grateful for your time. I know it's you got a little bit of a window. So until then, where can people find you online and on social media so they can follow your work, check out your tours, and so much more?
JimmyDore.com. And I just want to say thanks for all the work you're doing over at Hard Lens. It's important. I appreciate your honesty, your clarity, and your courage. So keep doing what you're doing.
Fantastic note to end it on. To our viewing audience, yes, we will be clipping this video segment, as well as including Jimmy Dore's 10-minute speech to the United Nations and a closing music from Jesse Jett. So to our entire audiences on YouTube, Rockfin, Rumble, Kick, and on Can TV, I thank you so much for your time. And Jimmy, all the best to you. We're going to be continuing on with the rest of our main show. Peace, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Greetings, Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council. I'm here to speak today about the attack on the Nord Stream pipeline that took place 1 year ago on September 26, 2022. 4 explosions ruptured the Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines that carried natural gas from Russia to Europe. It was the biggest act of industrial sabotage in human history, severing the main artery for energy from Russia to Germany, cheap energy that was critical to maintaining Germany's industrial base. We have heard every cockamamie and ridiculous theory on how this happened. Now, you don't need to be a genius investigative reporter to figure out who was the culprit of the Nord Stream attack. Incredibly, most Western news outlets ignore the fact that the President of the United States, Joe Biden himself, announced on February 9, 2022, that he would in fact attack the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, saying, and I quote, "If Russia invades Ukraine, tanks crossing the border again, there will no longer be a Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We will bring an end to it. I promise you, we will be able to do it." Even with that pre-admission of guilt from the President of the United States, most of the Western press remained baffled as to who could have pulled off the greatest act of eco-terrorism in history. But luckily, we don't have to rely on my interpretation of President Biden's clear threat to attack the pipelines. We actually have Seymour Hersh, a genius investigative reporter with impeccable reputation and credentials, who reported that in June of 2022, United States Navy divers operating under the cover of a widely publicized summer NATO exercise known as Baltops 22 planted the remotely triggered explosives that 3 months later destroyed 3 of the 4 Nord Stream pipelines, according to a source with direct knowledge of the operational planning. And like all criminals, the perpetrators could not contain their elation over committing the crime. Shortly after the attack, many high-ranking U.S. officials could not help but brag about their achievements and expressed multiple times how they were proud of being able to put an end to the pipelines. Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland said, "I am, and I think the administration is, very gratified to know that Nord Stream 2 is now, as you like to say, a hunk of metal at the bottom of the sea." The United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken called it a tremendous opportunity to once and for all remove the dependence on Russian energy. You have to be a paid liar to not acknowledge the hand of the United States in carrying out these attacks. Not only did President Biden declare he would do this, but high-ranking U.S. officials have said similar things for years. We can look to 2014 when former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice stated that over the long run, you simply want to change the structure of energy dependence. You want to depend more on North American energy platforms, which is what this is really all about. An economic war between the West and Russia in order to fill the pockets of rapacious capitalists who actually pull the strings of the U.S. government and dictate foreign policy. So let's pull back and take a look at the context in which this pipeline bombing occurred, shall we? It's all happening under the guise of defending Ukraine from an unprovoked Russian invasion. But of course, that's only true if you start the story of the Ukraine war somewhere near the end of the story instead of the beginning, which would indict Ukraine, the US, and NATO. The US and NATO are to blame, which is why the Western media always leaves the origin of this conflict out of their coverage and leaves most people in the dark with a false version of the cause of the conflict. Most Americans believe that Vladimir Putin woke up one day and decided for no particular reason to invade Ukraine and start a war completely out of the blue. This is what supporters of the Ukraine in this war actually believe, because that's the only narrative they hear from their news media, which is funded by the people who profit off this war, the military-industrial complex, the fossil fuel companies in the West, and of course, Wall Street. To make a crude analogy of the Western media's coverage of the Russian invasion is the following. Let's say Vladimir Putin was standing on a bus stop and there was an old lady standing in the street and a bus was heading straight for her. So Vladimir Putin pushes the old lady out of the way of the oncoming bus and down onto the concrete sidewalk. The Western corporate media would start that story near the end saying, Russian president pushes old lady down onto the concrete. The same goes for the entirety of the Ukraine-Russian war. The Western media starts the story of the war at February 24th, 2022, which is definitely not when this conflict started. They leave out the 2014 coup of the democratically elected Ukraine government orchestrated by the CIA in conjunction with Ukraine Nazis. They leave out the fact that the Russian-speaking ethnic population in the eastern part of Ukraine, known as the Donbass, didn't want to go along with the CIA Nazi coup government. And so the newly coup right-wing Ukraine government started shelling the citizens of the Donbass via their henchmen, known as the Nazi Azov Battalion, that ended up killing somewhere around 18,000 civilians in the Donbass. They leave out also there was a peace agreement that was reached to end the shelling by the Ukraine government and the Nazi Azov Battalion, known as the Minsk Accord, because the people who broke that peace agreement was not Russia, but the Ukraine government and the Nazis. They leave out the fact that there was already an overall peaceful way to avoid war and the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of precious Ukrainians, which was recently admitted to by the Secretary General of NATO, who admitted that it was the expansion of NATO onto Russia's border that was the real prevarication, and the US and NATO refused to stop their expansion onto Russia's border. All this amnesia is necessary for the continued aggression and warmongering of the US and NATO to be accepted by the citizens of the United States and Europe. Well, I'm here to cure them of their amnesia and remind them of the true cause of not only the Nord Stream bombing, but of the entire Ukraine war and the destabilization of the Middle East, including Libya, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. The reason for that is the imperialistic lust of the United States empire. The U.S. now has over 800 military bases around the world without being able to cite an actual threat to their sovereignty. The U.S. is now ending its empire the way all empires end, by overextending itself militarily while it starves its own people at home. The real threat is the threat of U.S. economic interests. The U.S. has for decades feared German engineering and capital joining Russia's natural resources and manpower. As elucidated very clearly by the founder of the U.S. intelligence firm Stratford, George Friedman, in his 2010 book, says, quote, Russia does not threaten America's global position, but the mere possibility that it might collaborate with Europe, and particularly Germany, opens up the most significant threat in a decade, a long-term threat that needs to be nipped in the bud. Therefore, maintaining a powerful wedge between Germany and Russia is of overwhelming interest to the United States. For the U.S., Friedman added in 2015, the primordial fear is German technology and German capital combining with Russian natural resources and Russian manpower to form the only combination that has for centuries scared the hell out of the United States. In this showdown, the U.S. aims to control the line from the Baltics to the Black Sea. Russia, by contrast, must have at least a neutral Ukraine, not a pro-Western Ukraine, because a neutral Ukraine would impede the primordial U.S. goal of a Russian-German fissure. The U.S. has opted for a proxy war instead. The Western governments are silent, even as the U.S. says through anonymous sources that Ukraine is responsible for the Nord Stream attack, but they won't blame them publicly. And so the United States continues to arm Ukraine to the teeth in hopes of extending the war and avoiding peace. The Germans say it's Ukraine, but will not release their official investigation and will not make an announcement. The final obscenity is that the people in the West who claim to be environmentalists and claim to care about climate change and the environment say nothing about the worst release of methane gas in human history, but in fact, whose actions reveal they don't actually care about climate change and continue to support this war and its eco-terrorism. In a bizarre twist, even Greta Thunberg traveled to Ukraine to meet with Zelensky after the Nord Stream bombing. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
I guess this isn't such an awful place. Is that what you want me to say? You prove it's possible to sleep for days and to still think you're right here awake. The cost of living isn't much to make, but God, it's so hard to save. And when they told you everything was safe, were you safe? Were you safe? Were you safe? Were you safe? I guess this isn't such an awful place. Is that what you want me to say? You prove it's possible to sleep for days and to still think you're right here awake. The cost of living isn't much to make, but God, it's so hard to say. And when they told you everything was safe, were you safe? Were you save? Will you save? Will you save?
Fresh off the masses, the brand new cancerous growth, who has come here to vie for your vote. Come here to cry at the camps and to mourn at the shore for the bodies that float by the wreck of an immigrant boat. Then it's back to their luxury home, couple security booths and a moat. Couple cigars, little escargot, little booze and a soak. Just breathe in the steam and the smoke. Pink salt, lavender, candles are low. Shit, when you do what you do, gotta lighten the load. And he got a life of his own that's a sight to behold. And it's a lot to control, to decipher the code, or to siphon the soul. The cost of a good night's sleep for the working elite is a bargain, no matter the toll. Worth any wager, and that comes straight from the mouth of the means to the goal that will swallow us whole. Ripe for the picking if you don't mind mold, and you know I don't. Maybe we're pleasantly prone, maybe we're taking a licking, compliantly ticking and ticking and ticking, but never explode. No, I don't deliver the prettiest image, but damn if it isn't an accurate vision of natural fission, of rage at the system and abject heartbreak, patiently waiting for any who will listen. That little blue bird who was watching your words is a federal carrier pigeon, a Langley first. It's a patient observer who hears what it wants and is trained for the worst. Oh, you got nothing to hide. They'll be the ones to decide that after they root through your purse, after they read all your text, after they raid your apartment, confiscate all of its contents, then conjure up evidence out of the air on a wing and a prayer and malicious intelligence nonsense. Any presumption of innocence long since gone, right along with your comforts and constants. Historically first they will come from the communists. So why in the fuck would I say I'm a communist? Well, it might be I love my community more than the monsters of opulence who are holding us hostage, who are vomiting promises. Might be I'm all done seeing our pensions and benefits harvested. Might be I'm all done watching the populace being disarmed in the guise of an armistice. Watching a woman collapse on the floor who will rise no more. She's wheeled out the door and you're next in line for the pharmacist. If you can get me to vote, it's a hard no confidence. But part of the charm and deception is politics wearing the mask of incompetence. It's all in the art of austerity, darling. It's all in the slide of the providence. Until home is as wide as your cubicle height and is only as deep as your coffin is. Maybe I'm miles away from impatience, aching to break off the head of the snake where the capital lust, reptile brain, and the margin of profit is. Like off with his. Like off with his.
I guess this isn't such an awful place. Is that what you want me to say? You prove it's possible to sleep for days and to still think you're right here awake. The cost of living isn't much to make, but God, it's so hard to save. And when they told you everything was safe, were you safe?